My name is Ashlyn Wing. I'm an elementary and special education major at New England College. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel this morning entitled Immigration and the 2016 Election. National and local experts discuss what the 2016 presidential elections will mean for the immigration reform. The panel's diverse backgrounds will allow students to see the vast impact of immigration reform across many disciplines, highlighting the necessity for the issue to remain at the forefront of the New Hampshire voters, businesses, and presidential candidates. And now I'd like to invite the members of the panel to introduce themselves. Thank you.
So hi everyone, my name is Scott Spradling. I've been working with New England College to help put these events together, but I'm also someone who is working on this particular topic and this issue as someone who is working with a group called Granite Staters for Common Sense Immigration Reform. People have asked me personally, Scott, why have you come to this? You have a news background, you worked at Channel 9 for years, and quite frankly, that's the reason why I've come to this particular issue, especially at this time when the issue of immigration seems to have been front and center from the earliest days of this presidential cycle. Quite frankly, it's because it's not new to this presidential cycle. I had the honor of being able to work for Channel 9 for a number of presidential cycles and participated in national debates and had a chance to cover the presidential candidates and had the honor of being able to work with ABC and CNN back in the 2007-2008 presidential primary cycle. And I remember working up these exact same questions about immigration and immigration reform to people that were running for president like Mitt Romney and John McCain. And so more than 8 years ago, close to 10 years ago, we were actively pushing this issue, asking these questions, and here we are nearly a decade later, and I just don't think we've seen the progress that we need. This is an important issue because it's more than just about the humane treatment of people. It's more than just a connection to our nation's foundation and history. It's also an economic issue. You can stop and look at the numbers around immigration and immigration reform and start looking at what financial and fiscal impact these policy decisions have on all of us, on our state, on our region, and on our country. So I'm honored to have a panel of esteemed experts, folks that walk the walk and understand this issue backwards and forwards, from a policy perspective out of Washington, from a business perspective out of New England, and from an immigration legal reform type perspective here in New England. So Todd, Jeff, and Elsa are here to join us. And Jeff, why don't I start with you? Introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do and any opening statement you might have.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. My name is Jeff Goldman. I've been practicing immigration law in Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts for the past 25 years. I run the immigration groups at two of the country's largest law firms, and 5 years ago I broke off and have my own small practice in Kendall Square in Cambridge. I practice business immigration, so my clients are technology and life science companies who are consistently and constantly searching to find the talent they need. My clients are in the Silicon Valley, they're in Massachusetts, New York, Florida, and a lot of small technology companies here in New Hampshire. I also do a tremendous amount of pro bono political asylum and refugee work. So for 20 years, I've had a lot of representation of people seeking safety and asylum in the United States, and I'm very familiar with that system. 2 weeks ago, I had the honor of being sworn in as Governor Charlie Baker's the new head of his advisory council on refugee and immigration matters.
Thank you, Jeff. Elsa?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm Elsa. I am the CEO and founder of Agora. Agora is a social platform for you to build engaged communities through online town halls. So as we speak now, this panel is actually being live streamed on Agora. So users from all over the country are actually watching this panel. Because we're trying to bring democracy to the 21st century by using technology. So you can use online town halls to engage so that more people can be part of the conversation. I graduated from Harvard Business School and Harvard Kennedy School last year. And when I came out, I started this company. And so my perspective in immigration reform is through being the CEO and founder of a technology startup based in Boston. And I've run into tremendous difficulties finding talents, getting people to join our company, because of the hurdles that were set up by very archaic policies. And I myself am a first generation immigrant, so I also experienced immigration in different ways. So, I think by starting talking about why we're here, I experience this problem in a daily basis. And I'm really excited to be in this panel to talk more about it with other experts, but really to share the industry perspective of how important this problem is and common sense reform needs to happen. So, glad to be here.
Thank you, Elsa. Todd?
Yeah, sure. I'm Todd Schulte. I am with an organization called Fwdus. Fwdus was started 2.5 years ago with the purpose of trying to bring some campaign infrastructure or muscle to help get immigration reform over the finish line. We were started by a lot of leaders in the business and technology community, people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn, Marissa Mayer. These are all now my best friends. We hang out all the time. And I encourage you to use their products. But, we've changed a lot over the last 2.5 years in the immigration space. When we started, we had what's called comprehensive immigration reform, one bill that we were working really hard to get across the finish line. We were able to do that in 2013 through the Senate. We didn't get that through the House. Now, I don't think Congress is going to do anything in the next year, but I'm really optimistic, and we are working really hard to make sure that in 2017 we can pass immigration reform that makes sure that we're fixing and modernizing our legal immigration system, making sure that we have sensible and strong border and interior security provisions, and make sure that we have a pathway to citizenship for the 11.5 million people who are undocumented in this country. And so excited to get to see so many people here today.
Thanks, Todd. So thanks to all three of you. Let me start with a quick question. By a show of hands, I'm just curious, for those of you who would be voters in this election cycle for the race for president, by a show of hands, how many of you are motivated by the issue of immigration reform? And don't feel like because you're sitting in here, you have to say, ooh, me. Okay. And so how many of you are here because you're curious about it and not quite sure how big a deal of an issue this is for this particular cycle? Okay, so we've got a pretty decent mix of the two. So let me start with this. Let me, for the second group, answer this question. Why does this matter? Why does it matter to you, to New Hampshire, and to New England? From an economic, from a numbers perspective, for the three of you, what's at stake if we don't get this right? Why does this matter? I'll let any of you, Todd, maybe you want to just start us off. Why does it matter?
Sure. So, on a very top line level, I think it's important to understand there's broad agreement that the status quo that we have in the immigration system doesn't work. Now, there are very different ideas of what we should do. Why does this election matter? Well, look, for really the first time in a long time, you have candidates out there who are talking about a militarized roundup or mass deportation of 11.5 million people, who are talking about putting a halt on high-skilled immigrants being able to come to this country here. To give you an idea of what that is, there's a conservative economist who did a study on this, a group called the American Action Forum. And he said, the cost of rounding up 11.5 million people, kicking them out of the country and keeping them out of the country would be $600 billion. So that's like an astronomically huge figure that like 6 billion, 600 billion, like I don't have either of those figures, so it's hard to like really understand what it is. But let me put it in context this way. In 2015 dollars, it would cost us, the Apollo program, we put people on the moon, cost us $100 billion. So what's being proposed in a bad sense is 6 times what it costs to put people on the moon. The cost of the economy is $2 trillion. But from just again a big economic perspective, and then I'll hand it over to other people, what we are talking about, where we make sure we have an immigration system that allows the best and the brightest to come here and stay here, that gives people legal status so they can get paid a minimum wage, so they can open bank accounts more easily. This generates incredible economic activity. That's going to generate $1 trillion in economic activity. It's going to be $100 billion to help pay down the deficit. So we see this as just an incredible economic driver for our country. And this election you're really seeing this litigated.
Elsa?
So I want to talk about why this is important, like the number perspective. Tyler did a great job talking about it. When I went to college and I was in grad school, I have so many friends who are international students, or they came here, when they're in high school and then they finish college, and then they're sent back to their own countries. They were here to get a first-rate education. I mean, there's so many amazing colleges in New Hampshire, New England, and you probably know someone in your circle who spend so much time in the US and they become so acculturated and they want to start companies, they want to work for great companies here. And then they have to go home. And I have a number of friends who somehow went through all the hoops and were able to stay, and they created jobs, they created startups that made innovations happen in New England area. And let's not forget Sergey Brin, who founded Google. He came from Soviet Union. His parents, Steve Jobs, like his father was natural-born father was an immigrant from Syria. I mean, I think by nature, a lot of immigrants who jump through all these difficulties to come here for an education, for a chance to pursue their dreams, they are very entrepreneurial. And so as an entrepreneur, I've seen so many people who were turned away because of that. And why is it important? Because this is not what our country is about. This is not what America is about. And I experience that problem every day in my own circle in technology startups. And that is such a huge problem that we have to solve. And that has to be the most important issue in election time. So I think that from that perspective, that is extremely important to us.
Jeff, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, immigration is important because jobs are important to our economy and to everyone in this room. I'm not talking about the need for Uber or Google to get 10 more software engineers in India. I'm talking about the backbone of the American economy, small businesses. I represent a small business here in New Hampshire. They have gone from 2 to 25 employees in 1 year. And that's just their engineering team. What they do is they manufacture packaging for pharmaceuticals, and they do it all right here in New Hampshire. And while they've hired 22 to 25 engineers in 1 year, they've hired 180 new people working on the manufacturing end of things. They couldn't do it if they couldn't get 2 engineers who had the technology here from India. And one of them missed the H-1B lottery last year, and it was a nightmare for them. And they honestly thought they were going to start laying people off. I was able to help them get that man here through another mechanism other than H-1B, but the truth is, this is insane. Every time this company hires 1 engineer, it supports almost 20 new hires of American people. And that may not be true everywhere, but that's true for this company here in New Hampshire. That's why I care about immigration, and that's why we should all care about it.
Jeff, quick follow-up. H-1B visas. It's something that we hear a lot on the campaign trail. It's certainly a topic of conversation that we at the state level who are talking about this care about, because we want to see more of these visas made available nationwide. Jeff, can you quickly explain what is an H-1B visa and how difficult is it to get? Because I've heard the process described as nothing short of like winning the lottery if you get one of these H-1B visas, because they are so difficult to get.
H-1B visas are for specialty occupations, which by definition means a U.S. employer has a job that requires a specialized degree in order to do the job. And years back, Congress said, we will create an H-1B visa to help American companies bring in that special talent that's needed. It requires a person to have at least a bachelor's degree, and the company must need someone with a specialized bachelor's degree to fill the job. There are all sorts of wage documentation that is quite intense that an employer must go through in order to hire an H-1B. They're limited in number. Back when it was a different world and not a global economy, Congress decided that 65,000 was the most H-1Bs we could have every year. They then added another 20,000 if the foreign national has a master's degree or higher from a U.S. university. So basically we have 85,000 H-1Bs available every fiscal year. Right now, we're just in the first quarter, we just finished the first quarter of the federal fiscal year. The 85,000 H-1Bs were long gone before the fiscal year even started, because you're allowed to apply 6 months in advance, which is April 1st. Picture this. last April 1st, the United States Immigration Service received 233,000 H-1B applications within the first 4 days, which caused them to cut off accepting any more H-1Bs. They conducted a lottery, so it's not just, it's real, it is a
It is a
lottery.
lottery.
And they picked out the 85,000 winners, and everyone else was out of luck. Some people may be able to get some other status, some people might have another year in school, but many, many, many had to go home. So that's what H-1B is. It needs reform in many ways, and my biggest grief with the current H-1B process is there aren't enough. And for those that say we shouldn't have any, it makes no sense, and there can't be any smart thinking person out there that would look at the economy and say we would be better off without H-1Bs. However, there is abuse, and we have to stop it. And the abuse comes from, in my opinion, too few companies get the bulk of the H-1Bs. I represent a lot of startups, a lot of small companies, and they need an H-1B worker just as much as Google does. But because Google can file 2,000 H-1B petitions on April 1st, hoping that they'll get 800 software engineers, that's good for them. But I have a company who's filing 2 H-1B applications on April 1st, and they're desperate for both. But they're not going to make it, and this system isn't right, that it would let a Google or any big company take up that many H-1Bs without training US workers to do it first. That's my opinion.
Yeah. And probably one that many in Washington and around the country would agree is necessary. However, Todd, I'm going to ask you the pointed question that I know we've heard on the campaign trail about all this, because quite frankly, you're all sitting here, many of you are maybe in school still, thinking about the next step, getting ready to join the career path, and hearing stuff like this, the idea that perhaps we're letting tens of thousands of well-trained people come in and take the jobs that are available in the US sounds kind of threatening, doesn't it? Like, wait, well, hold on a second, what about me? I just got my degree. I want first dibs on this kind of thing, right? It's an important question, but Todd, what is the answer to that question? Because, and Jeff, you sort of hinted at it about 2 engineers yielding dozens of jobs around one particular business. But what is the response to those who are concerned that, hey, wait a minute, what about jobs for college kids that are coming out right out of New England?
Well, it's a great question, and I think that when we hear all the time, and the answer, the bumper sticker slogan is this: it's a false choice to say that we can't have immigrants who help grow the economy and create jobs for native-born Americans and protect American workers. And that's what we should have an immigration system that does. If you look at what Congress passed, I mentioned a bill through the Senate in 2013, this is a bill that went after a lot of abuses of the system. It was a bill that made sure that H-1Bs and green cards were really going to make sure they were the best and the brightest. These people were going to create jobs for the economy, create jobs for native-born Americans here. We need to make sure that, in addition to having more H-1Bs, we have an H-1B system that makes sure that we have a wage force so that people aren't coming in and getting paid a lot less. People aren't coming into the United States here and getting trained up by somebody who's been on the job for 25 years and then being told, like, we're going to hire this person for a lot less. You hear a lot about these companies whose business model is to bring people into the United States. Look, you saw this in Florida, you've seen this in California, where you have companies who are essentially bringing in people and displacing American workers here. The reason that is allowed to happen is because Congress hasn't gotten off its behind in the last 25 years and actually passed something. We are dealing with a high-skilled immigration system that hasn't been updated since the Soviet Union fell. I mean, just think about that for a second. Like, in a bit, I'm going to ask you all to pull out your phone to do something, but think about like where the internet was, where the technology sector was. I'm pretty sure Gore wasn't around in 1990 when the modern kind of high-skilled immigration system came out. We should have an immigration system that makes sure that we're bringing the best and the brightest to grow the economy, and not bringing in just to compete with American workers, because that's not what the immigration system is designed to do and what it should do.
Now, so let me ask you this question too. Is there a positive way of looking at this idea of bringing in best and brightest, of whether they're, like you pointed out, educate them here and then try to keep them here to expand the jobs, but is there a positive way of looking at this from a business owner's perspective, from the brain drain perspective? Because it strikes me that if you keep bringing in the best and the brightest, that not only are they going to create jobs like what Jeff mentioned, but there's an educational opportunity here as well, right? Is there a rising tide lift all boats argument in all of this, or am I off base?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there is actually a huge shortage of talents in engineering all over the country, and a lot of companies are trying to look for talents, and so the shortage actually doesn't help, like by making it harder to scale your team. And so, we could hire people who might have less experience in engineering, but they don't have mentors. They need people who have more experience to help them out. And so, for example, in my engineering team, we have people from all over the world, and working together, that's actually really important for people to train. So think about education not just from the college or going to school perspective. There's actually job training that we bring in because of high-skill immigration. And we function better as a technology company because we can bring these people in to really nurture that sector. And obviously people get trained and then they go to a different company or they start their own companies, and that just grows. And that cluster of talent, that's what we need to cultivate. And thinking about, I know that immigration implies country and border lines, but we are a global economy. What America, what our country stands for is that we want to be the hub of innovation. So regardless of what passport you're born with, if you are a talented, ambitious entrepreneur person and you want to found a company and create innovation and benefit a country or the world, you should come to America, because this is the best system that you can start companies. And that's why I love doing a startup in here, because that is the best system for me here. And so that way we can actually build a global hub of talent. And right now we can't, because we cannot bring them in, and therefore the cluster, the effect doesn't happen. And another point that I was hearing the panelists talk about, and also me from a technology startup point of view, is that the workforce, the way we see it now is very different. So in the past, if you hire somebody, you might have a whole year you can bring them in, and so you can go through the H-1B process, which we didn't mention, but it's a yearly process. So you actually can't bring people in, in September. You have to wait until April. And that's a whole half a year, and companies live and die in that period of time. And so when we talk about an agile workforce economy, for startups, we want to hire people tomorrow. We're looking for interns, so you guys want to apply, I can hire you tomorrow. But if I cannot tell you you're going to have a job or not for 6 months, where are you going to go? So a lot of startups actually could die because of this cycle. Now, big companies can actually wait, and they can wait for 6 or 9 months, but so many startups cannot have that time period of time. And that is also, the point that you were making about how the economy is evolving at a speed much faster than law. And this is time for us to really reform that.
I just to jump on that, I can't stress enough how much, if you are, and look, we work with a lot of these folks, if you are a big multinational company, you have financial resources and you are spread out across the globe, you have the ability to, if Congress won't pass immigration reform, and you need to put people, you can put them in some other countries, and you can hire really good lawyers, and you can do all that stuff. And I'm very supportive of hiring really good lawyers. I want to be clear on that.
There you go, Jeff.
And I'm putting a plug, if you always do an immigration panel with an attorney, because someone will ask a question I won't know the answer to. But it's such, in an economy that moves so fast, even for the best and the brightest and most well-resourced, think about being told you can't start your company for 18 months. I can't tell you how much I hear it of the uncertainty. Every call I did with my co-founder, we were 6 hours apart on time zones. Think about how hard it is to get up and start a company here. The second thing I'll just say is the economy isn't zero sum. Not that long ago in this country, most people who started technology sectors were white men. And I say that because after World War II, when women entered the workplace in huge numbers, we had the broadest prosperity we have ever had, and we were stronger because of that. Both the women who entered the workforce and everyone else in the country here. The idea that, I'll just point to you, there was not someone sitting there waiting to start your company, and you took a job from them. That's not how the economy works. but so often it is easier to point at people and say, maybe things aren't as good as you'd like them to be because someone else took a job from you. And that's just not the way the economy works. It is sometimes the way that people want to make the economy work in 30-second political ads.
About H-1B visas, but the immigration world and the reforms that we're talking about, that's one lane of a wide highway. So I kind of want to go back to Jeff for just a second as the expert in the trenches on this, because you mentioned that there are things that are broken right now, and Todd just laid out at least one thing with Elsa's help, talking about that long wait that you mentioned. Having to speed up the process, streamline it is one thing. What else is broken in our system right now? And if it is as archaic as Todd described, being a sort of a Soviet Union era immigration policy, how does that hurt us right now in other ways? Outside of H-1Bs, what's broken?
Well, we have a system of permanent residency in this country where we give out a very limited number of permanent immigrant visas, also known as green cards, every year. And we have a rule that certainly goes back 20, 30 years ago, before there was a global economy, that limits the number of green cards we give out per year. And within the limit, it says that no country can have more than 7%. Well, that was before India and China and other countries were producing incredibly innovative and valuable engineers. So if you can't take up more than 7%, that means there's going to be a backlog. And I don't know if you all know, but we have horrific backlogs for people from India and China. And frankly, even for people from England and Canada and everywhere else, if you don't have a master's degree. So the system is broken.
What's the wait? How long do you have to wait?
If you have a master's degree or a PhD from India, you could be waiting 6 to 7 to 8 years. And that is good, because it used to be 10 years. But things have sped up a little bit, and the only reason it's sped up is because so many people have given up and left that the wait list or the queue isn't as long as it used to be. But how can an American company function when it has valuable employees who have been here for years and they can't become permanent residents because there's an artificial limit on their country of birth? It's not making sense, and we have to change so much in the permanent resident system.
Okay. So this conversation is clearly not happening in a vacuum. If this was just all about the economy and jobs, then great. It makes it even more of a common sense maneuver to fix what's broken, change these numbers, and let's get rolling. But we're also dealing with border security. We're also dealing with terrorism. We're also dealing with an environment right now where probably most people, if they're not worried about it or scared about it, they're at least paying attention to the idea of, let's make sure that our system is not allowing people who might want to do us harm to somehow slip into the country. So, Todd, I'll start with you. How do we balance, and can we balance, this conversation about meaningful immigration reform and still protecting our borders and keeping our nation secure?
Absolutely, and that's the approach that we think is really important. You hear a lot about security, and that gets wrapped up with the border. You've heard a lot about building the border wall.
It's going to be a great wall, by the way.
And I think it's really important to understand, the first thing that when you hear people talk about a pathway to legal status or a pathway to citizenship, or when you hear about the president's executive action that so many people are in favor of and other people are opposed to, does anybody know the first thing that people have to go through when they do that? It starts with a security background check. And the idea is we should, in addition to, putting $30 or $40 billion more towards smart border security, and look, that's drones and that's more agents. It's making sure the fence is finished in some places and completed differently in others. But
you're saying we should do that, right?
We support that at Ford. We think, but the key is this: you need to pair that with a process where people can get right with the law. And the reason you need to do them together isn't just because that's the way the politics fit together on this issue. The reason you need to do this together is because for people who are here illegally, half those people, they came here on a legal visa and they fell out of status. Half the people crossed the border and came some other way here. but giving people a process that first and foremost starts with, hey, you know what, like you're gonna pass a background check, and if you're a felon, if you have, if you are a hardened criminal, like you are not welcome in this country. We think that's the right way to go when you pair that with security. The idea that security is all about a border wall is wrong. The idea that security is just about rounding people up is equally wrong too. We think you need to look at this as pairing these things together. And once you give that legal status to people, then you can just put it in places things like E-Verify, which will make it so that when you go to a workplace, people have to sign up to make sure they're here legally. We think that is a balanced way to go that not only, you know, it is right for America and right for the people who, recent immigrants who come here, it just quite frankly is a much more secure way to go about the system.
You raised your hand. I want to give you a chance to ask some questions about it.
Yes, sir. I just had a question about the background checks. In a lot of countries, particularly where we have refugees come from, there's no records. You know,
Like Syria.
Yeah, exactly. Like Syria, like in Africa in particular, where you have places where technically there's a government, like in Somalia, but really, in all truth and reality, there is no government. How can you conduct a background check on somebody there's no records for?
Good question. Jeff, what do we do? Not to put this on your shoulders, sir. But how do we handle it?
Well, I have had clients who were delayed years over that issue. And I think sometimes they just don't get in. I know that with many visa categories, if you don't clear a background security check, you don't get in. And I'm not saying, I don't know exactly what they do if they can't really determine who you are. I do think that we have tremendous databases these days that can search anything. And you may not have a birth record, you may not have records, but you have fingerprints and you have DNA, and it's getting far more sophisticated than ever. And I think we do the best we can. We can't survive. It's not American to move forward and be afraid of every possibility of any person being a terrorist. I don't believe in it. I think we have to have the most sophisticated security system we can get, and for me, that's good enough.
And Jeff, what does it look like right now? I mean, you're probably in this room, physically closest to this process. How high are the hurdles, and how big are the hoops that you have to jump through in order to apply and get in? Especially considering there are some countries that don't have paperwork they can just send to you quickly. What's it look like?
It's huge. It takes years to get through sometimes. I mean, for refugees, it's been well documented that they go through almost a 2-year background check where they're sitting in refugee camps around the world. And that's appropriate, that's good. That should make Americans feel more comfortable. In other areas, I have a client from the UK. His daughter's a US citizen. We applied, he and his wife were approved for green cards. They went through the background security check. And the sophistication was unbelievable, but they found a record that at age 19, he had been arrested for sleeping in someone else's car overnight. He claimed he was drowning in his sorrows when Princess Diana died. And he forgot about that. He didn't disclose it. It caused a 1-year delay. He's the father of a US citizen. A 1-year delay because the system caught it and they wanted information. They wanted to understand why he didn't disclose it over and over and over again. It went back and forth until they were satisfied. He just arrived a year after his wife did. So the security checks are pretty sophisticated.
I would just add 2 other things on, you brought this up. You know, one, I think it's important to understand, and there's this misconception like I'm applying for asylum in the United States, because you hear that a lot. That's actually not how the refugee system works. The refugee system is you go to a camp, you go through the UN Commission, and then you are placed in a country. I think that's a really important point. If someone is trying to come to this country to do bad things, the refugee system is and I can't stress enough, is a particularly bad route to do it, because you can't even, once you get past this 2-year wait and these security checks and all these things, you can't direct yourself towards a particular country, and I think that's really important. You know, the second is from a numerical perspective. Look, like I want to be really clear, there are people who are trying to come to the United States to do really bad things to the United States. If you look at the 750,000 refugees who have come to the United States since 9/11, one has been convicted of a terrorism-related incident. And I think numerically that is a really important thing. Now, and I will just say here, it is really important to understand that the idea of having a legal immigration system that works, having a legal immigration system with proper security, and granting legal status to the 11.5 million people who are here who pass a background check, those things all push in the same direction. There's this idea that there's a trade-off here. The trade-off is when you say, I'm going to keep people permanently in the shadows, that is, I just want to be clear, that is saying I'm also not going to make people go through a background check. So I think it's important to understand that we are pushing in the direction of security. We are pushing in this direction together.
And just to reinforce something, Todd, that you said earlier as a statistic, because there's a lot of talk about the 11.5 or 12 million undocumented who are here now. Did I hear you correctly that you said that upwards of half of those people went through the process, got the visas, had the so-called green card, and it just expired and they never left?
So it's not a green card, but about 45, it's an estimate, but about 45% of people came here on a valid visa, a student visa, a tourism visa, and what's called there an overstay, and they fell out of status.
Okay.
And for a lot of people, it could be they came here, they were on a student visa, they had a kid, and then, if you were in the United States for more than 6 months illegally, and this is like the fundamental problem that we face. Why can't people just get right with the law? Because here's the issue, and I want everybody to think about this. I bet a lot of people in here probably, they're in school, they're not thinking about kids. But I just had a baby girl. She's very cute. I'll show you pictures afterwards. Her name is Sylvia. She is 4.5 months old. Now, let's say that I fell out of immigration status. In 6 months from now, right before she turned 1, somebody knocked on the door and they said, hey, you're out of immigration status. I would be faced with the following choices. I could leave the country and face what's called the 10-year bar, 3 and 10-year bar. This would say that I have to leave the country for 10 years before I can start the process again to apply for the legal immigration system. I'm being told that I came here, I was on a student visa, I had a daughter, and that's going to take me 5-6 years to probably be able to get back into legal status. So if you are here and you have a kid, we have a broken system of laws. And the law says to you, hey, you know what we think you should do is leave the country and cross your fingers you're back to help teacher get how to drive when they turn 16. That's when we talk about fully enforcing the law and we talk about making people work. We have a broken system of laws that makes people make fundamentally terrible choices.
And getting to the back of the line, Jeff, because that's what we hear in politics a lot too, right? You're going to follow our rules. You have to leave, get the back of the line, and then we'll let you back in. But just to underscore that point, that would mean potentially waiting 6, 8, 10 years. That's what getting to the back of the line would mean. So if you're Todd and you just had the baby and you're hoping to celebrate her first birthday, but now you're having to go get in the back of the line, you might see her again when she's 10. I mean, is that accurate or is that?
What Todd is talking about is different than the lengthy queues that nationals of India and China face because of our limitation of the number of visas that we give out every year, immigrant visas. What Todd is talking about is a 10-year bar that you face if you have overstayed your visa or your permission to be in the U.S. by more than 1 year. If you leave the U.S., you're out for 10 years. But you can't fix it here. There's no way to fix a problem of being out of status here in the U.S. We got rid of that. Years ago, the laws changed, so no longer can you pay an extra penalty, or no longer can an employer sponsor you, or no longer, in many cases, can you even marry a U.S. citizen to fix the problem here. You have to go abroad. Who's going to do that when another part of the law says you're out for 10 years?
Good question. Elsa, e-verification was something that was mentioned earlier, and it's something that our state group certainly supports and believes needs to have, up and running right now. But let's say that we're getting these reforms. Let's say that we're starting to correct some of these problems. Would e-verification as a business owner be something that you could see yourself relying on to have a system where you've got someone that's interviewing for a job, we've cleaned up some of these things, and now I've got a system by which I can electronically check to make sure that I'm hiring someone who's got the right status, has all the paperwork. Would you see that as a benefit?
Once we've fixed the broken system, I think making it easier, to keep track, like that's clearly using technology, that's great. But if we don't fix the system and people still can get in the country, it's very hard for us to grow a company. And so I think the greater point I'm hearing here is immigration is not just a policy question or a national security question, it's a moral question. It's a question about humanity. Like what Todd and Jeff are talking about, these are real people being separated from their families or being torn away from their dreams. And one of the people in our company, her mother was from Nicaragua, and she was a political refugee. Her uncle actually disappeared after the student protests during the dictatorship period. And had they not escaped and come to this country, like she wouldn't have gone to Harvard and joined my company, and nothing would have happened there. I mean, I think this is only one small story of the fabric of stories about how we as a country functions. And I think a lot of times candidates use fear tactic to make us feel scared that we want to close up. But this is a moment that tests who we are. And from a company perspective, from a family perspective, from a refugee perspective, these are all human beings. And that's something that we cannot forget. And we can talk about policies and numbers and all that, but this is really fundamental about our values. And so, you can hear about all the numbers, and I'm sure politicians talk about the shootings in Bernardino and how that system failed, and so we all want to have like stricter background checks, but think about the number of people who die because of domestic shootings versus, maybe this 1 or 2 cases of terrorist shootings. And there might be a bigger problem to fix elsewhere. So I think that's the panel is trying to bring out the point that this is a human issue from all perspectives of industry, legal, and policy.
One of the things you've seen me not do is to start throwing out candidate names and picking apart plans. You're all very intelligent people. You can make your own decisions based on your own priorities. One thing that our group has done, the Granite Staters for Common Sense Immigration Reform, is to say, look, we support and believe in border security. We support and believe in things like e-verification and assets to help small businesses. We believe fervently that this is an economic issue as well as a humane issue, and that we believe that everybody is served best by candidates who very clearly lay out their plans for immigration reform, including what to do with the 11 to 12 million. That's our reason for being in New Hampshire. Forward is doing much of that same work on a national level. So while I'm remembering, if you want to follow what Forward or Granite Staters for Common Sense Immigration Reform are doing, that's one way to sort of track what's going on. You can hear what the candidates are saying on a daily basis. My last question before I turn it over to questions here for the three of you, without painting targets on candidates' backs, because we've heard what Democrats and Republicans have all said, is there a single claim or misconception out there that you would most like to set the record straight for? And again, you don't have to name any names, you can if you want. But what's out there that's being said that you're just kind of like, no. Go ahead, Jeff.
The phrase, they gotta go. They gotta go. I'm sorry, but they gotta go. It makes no sense without backing it up with how you're going to do it and how you're going to pay for it. Todd threw out a number of 6 trillion or 60 trillion, whatever. It's outrageous the cost it's going to take the taxpayers to try to remove and deport 12 million. Now, I'm in the trenches a lot with undocumented people because I represent political asylum seekers in the immigration court. I was there last week, and so knowing I was coming here today, I went into the courtroom in the Boston Immigration Court, which is the courtroom where they do the actual deportation of people who are in custody. And I went in the courtroom, and there were 10 people in custody in handcuffs. I counted 5 security guards, 2 drivers, 3 court personnel, and 1 judge. And all day it took to deport those 10 people. And they didn't even get to submit defenses because they didn't have lawyers, and that no one told them just ask for political asylum. You'll delay by years. Right now, if you ask for political asylum in this country, it could be 4 years before you are standing in front of a deportation judge and getting your day in court. That system is broken. How are we going to pay for 12 million people? So I counted what roughly the salaries would be. And to deport those 10 people, I think it was costing $1 million a year. So if we deport 10 people a day for $1 million for those salaries, eventually I calculated, we're talking about $12 billion just to deport 10 people a day in this country. And that's just from the immigration court. Those are just those people I was looking at. What about the jails we're going to have to build? And what about the security? And what about the food that the people have to eat? How can a candidate stand in front of America and say they got to go without giving us any numbers and who's paying for it?
Thank you, Jeff. Elsa?
I think a lot of times the argument is made to say, well, we need innovation, but then we have to send people home or not let them come in to create innovation. And that's the biggest misconception, is to link the two things. And there's actually a really cool paper that talked about how the DNA of this country, of people who risked their lives and, with $2 in a pocket and came here, not just the last 10 years, the last hundreds of years. I mean, New England was founded by refugees. DNA is that they're entrepreneurs, that they take risks, that they create new things that nobody has imagined. And we created democracy as well. So I think the biggest misconception is to delink the two things and say, we can have innovation, and yet we can still have an archaic immigration system. Those two things actually cannot exist without each other. So I think that's the biggest thing to be aware of.
Thank you. Todd?
Yeah, I think in the political realm, the trap that I think people fall into is our opponents get away with saying things like buzzwords, like, well, I'm against amnesty, and they never have to say what they're for. They pick apart a current problem with the immigration system, and they say, those people just want more of that stuff. And it's interesting. I just think it is so important to make sure people understand that fixing our immigration system has all of the components that we've laid out so far that are important to us. It's not, you just see so much in the political realm. People go and they find someone who did something wrong, and they use that not even just to attack an entire group of people, but to attack an entire immigration system and completely pretend that people like us aren't up there trying to fix the system. And I think that's just a kind of a political messaging trap that I hope that we can all be a little bit better about.
Thank you, Todd. I know we have a couple minutes left for questions, and you, sir, with the beard, you had a question that I didn't get to just yet, so.
I'm just curious, when it comes to, you're saying that citizens who, not citizens, but people who come over here and obtain a visa, are allowed to live here and work here and all that good stuff, have children, whatever. But yet, when the visa expires, they don't do anything. Then they have 180 days. They do it within 180 days. They only get a 3-year bar. Or if they do it within 365, they get a 2-year bar, like you said. But what is the renewal process? And why is it taking us so long to get them out of here if they are breaking those rules and not renewing in that time? How long does it take for them to renew? And why aren't they doing that in the first place?
You're making it seem like they can just go down to City Hall and renew.
What's that process?
Well, the way you phrase the question makes it seem so simple to stay legal and to renew. Why are they not doing it? It's not so simple. And believe me, they would renew their stay if they could, but they can't. And so that's the first problem, is the misconception of that it's so easy to renew and stay legal. Why don't they just do that? Or once they're out of status, why don't they just go renew again and go back in status? Our
So what you're
laws
saying
don't
is it's
permit
not
it.
like it's not like it's going, because it's a good question. It's not
Yeah,
like it's going to the DMV. Is that
When should it begin? How should it begin? I mean, are we educating them beforehand? Or are we just allowing them to have it expire?
If they come as a visitor, they probably are getting 6 months to stay in the U.S. And yes, they can file for an extension, and they have to file it at least 1 day before their status expires. So many people will start thinking about that a good 2 months. They've been here for 4 months, and they're realizing, I really can't finish what I came here to do, whether it was visiting friends, relatives, investigating business opportunities without working, they realize, hopefully in time, that they need to file for an extension. Many just don't know what they're still doing after 6 months, and they just stay. I think that's the issue.
And I think the important thing to keep in mind, I think it's a great question, it goes back to, and I can't stress this enough, we should have an immigration system that allows people to continue to find ways to stay in this country to fulfill these different visa categories. I think the issue is what we're saying is we have a legal system that is broken. It does not work. That says if you are here on an H-1B and for whatever reason you are fired, your company closes up, you have to leave the country in 10 days. So, you are here, you have a family here, you have kids in school here, or not. There's no extension to that. And people, they try and they go through all these hurdles that in and of themselves are so problematic for our country here. But I think it's so important to understand here, this is not a system of people who just chose not to go through some process where they can just go down to an office and get something stamped. That's not what this is. We have a legal system that makes people make terrible choices, and we need to change that legal immigration system so that people don't have to do that anymore.
That's a great question. Thank you. And unfortunately, we're out of time. So on behalf of Todd, Elsa, and Jeff, thank you very much for being here. If you missed anything, you want to chat with them for a couple minutes, I'm sure they can stick around and get any extra questions answered, but thank you all.